Welcome back. Hopefully you got a chance to talk to someone interesting over lunch and learn more about the surroundings. I know that some of the speakers told me that they got fantastic questions from you guys, and some people that didn't get a limerick complained that I let them go on stage without introducing them. So I promise that any person who wants can sign up for a limerick made either by me or by a machine for the next 24 hours. We have plenty for all. The next session, we're going to have two speakers, one after the other, and then we're going to have a conversation, three of us on stage, about world peace and how to essentially take the challenges of the world and make them most peaceful as possible. The first speaker, Beatrice Fihn, was on the stage at PopTech 2017. Back then, she spoke about nuclear weapons. As she was helming the ICANN organization, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. She spoke also about how it feels and how it works when you win the Nobel Peace Prize that year. And she spoke about her vision for the coming years. We had a lot of turmoil since when it comes to how to deal with world conflicts and prevent them. She's going to speak to us today about the same topic, wearing a different hat. She's took her knowledge of international policy and law and started a new organization that is all about trying to expand what she was doing before and really help the world prevent kind of conflicts. Followed by Shamil Idris, who's the CEO of the Search for Common Ground, an organization that was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 2018, Nobel Peace Prize, I should say, 2018, and works across numerous countries to prevent conflict in an interesting and clever way. Shamil himself is helming this organization for a while, and he also acted as deputy in the UN, the deputy director of the Alliance on Conflict, the World Economic Forum, innovator in global, what's the title? Young Global, and has numerous hats that he's going to share with you on the stage. I give the microphone to the two of them right now.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be back at PopTech. A little bit more dire situation this time than in 2017. I remember talking about nuclear weapons, and it felt like a little bit hypothetical. I was like, we have to take this seriously, and people were like, yeah. Fast forward today, not so good on that front. We're a bit in trouble in the world right now. But I unfortunately missed this morning's session, but I heard something about how war between the US and China is inevitable. It's not. But we are in trouble, hurtling towards climate disaster, juggling threats like pandemics, seeing new wars, concerns about future wars, and such rapid advancements in things like artificial intelligence that we're really struggling to keep up with it. And one of the most challenging things that we're facing right now in the world is that really these big problems that we have, no country can solve them on their own. The consequences of these threats and these problems will actually hit us all. It will swoop across borders. It won't just stop because it's crossing a border, the consequences of these threats. They will impact us all. And therefore, global cooperation is an absolute must if we want to solve this. Which is challenging, right? Because at the same time, the sort of appetite for global cooperation is really declining, both between governments, but also in people. People are very cynical about our ability to solve these problems. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about international law in this moment, at a time when it feels like basically the world is shifting underneath our feet, and when many of us are really terrified about what's coming next. And it made me think a little bit about past really difficult times. And if you think about sort of early 1940s, we were in the middle of one of the most horrific wars that the world has ever seen. Nationalistic fascists, governments ruthlessly attacking, occupying neighboring nations, committing genocide, bombing cities. But also democratic states, carpet bombing civilians, using nuclear weapons to wipe out whole cities, colonizing lands all over the world. It's an incredible dark moment for humanity. And I can only imagine that people didn't feel particularly optimistic about the future then either. But fast forward a few years after World War II, the horrors that people discovered, people went through then, really created this emerging sense of never again. massive breakthroughs in how we operate as a global community. And the same states, with many of the same people, actually developed things like the United Nations, the Charter, which again, it can feel very cynical at this time, but it's an agreement that we respect each other's borders. We're not supposed to go to war with each other. I mean, they have the caveat of self-defense, and we all know how governments can interpret that in different ways. But the idea is that like war is not good. Like we're not going to just do that. They agreed to new laws about how you can conduct yourself in warfare. The Geneva Conventions, that it doesn't really matter who attacked whom and if it's self-defense or not. You're not allowed to target civilians. You're not allowed to target hospitals or schools. Attacks have to be proportionate to the attack that you met. And countries that had just a few years been bitter enemies, like France and Germany, for example, formed really deep economic cooperation, formed the European Union. US and Japan, the same thing. Developed things like the World Health Organization, so that all like national health authorities all around the world could figure out how they cooperate on things that are very, very important. Banned torture, developed human rights treaties, banned weapons of mass destruction, landmines. We even built courts, international courts, to arbitrate and try to rule in conflict between nations to prevent them from going to war. So out of horror came a lot of tools and solutions. Now, these were not flawless, obviously, and many of them had some pretty fundamental flaws and weaknesses. But actually, some of those fundamental flaws and weaknesses are the reason why we are here today. And it wasn't a perfect time. I mean, we saw, a Cold War, we saw horrible nuclear testing, illegal wars, civil wars, genocide in Africa, genocide in Europe. We saw many things. So obviously, it wasn't a perfect time. And some of these structures that we tried to solve these kind of problems through international cooperation, had some really deeply unfair aspects. I wanted to go through some of the key flaws in the system we built after 1945. We put 5 countries in a special category, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It's kind of like a global apartheid, that they somehow have more rights. And it's a very non-diverse group of countries. It's not really representative of the world the way it looks like. By coincidence, we also accepted that these countries and a few others have the power to basically end us all with nuclear weapons, but the other ones don't, right? So this also, again, this kind of like what the South African governments used to call nuclear apartheid. In that time, we also created the situation in Israel and Palestine, a deeply unfair and unjust situation. We have this hypocrisy built into the existing system. We created the situation with climate change, where some of the richest countries are spewing out the most emissions, harming countries that haven't really contributed to emissions at all. And those fundamental flaws in the system are really what's causing many of our problems today. So as we're feeling that the system is crumbling and really under a lot of pressure, we're seeing, for example, in this country, I'm from Sweden, in my country, nationalistic fascist trends, that kind of mentality is coming back. We're seeing Russia illegally invading Ukraine, trying to grab land, and it's a huge concern that we're going back to a time where that's just normal behavior among states. And of course, with coming climate change, it's going to put pressure on existing land, reduce agricultural land, reduce livable land. It's a huge worry that this is going to be how governments act in the future. We're seeing governments, both Russia and Israel, completely disregarding the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war, bombing civilians left, right, and center in the name of self-defense. So it's really easy to dismiss some of these international cooperation and international treaties. But at the same time, our world is becoming more and more complicated. And despite the best efforts of these nationalistic fascist trends, we are more connected than ever in the world. We're more dependent on each other than ever in the world. And there is a need, a must, to have some shared rules and norms for how we organize ourselves in the world. Without that, we really don't have any future of humanity. Because, as I said earlier, none of the problems we have, really the big problems, can be solved by one state. It doesn't matter if your state completely stops emissions if others don't. It doesn't matter if you have a perfect healthcare system but other countries don't and a pandemic happens. Our security, our survival completely depends on the actions of other states. So at the time when we think about the future and what's next, it's can be looking very, very dire. But it is also a huge opportunity to shape the world into better systems, new structures that are better adapted and more solid. So I want to give a couple of examples of things that are really unique at this moment that I think can have a positive impact on how we enter this uncharted territory that we're in. First, it's the fact that we are more connected than ever. This idea that we can isolate ourselves as countries, we have to give that up, just pragmatically. We going to have to work together. International rules are still needed in order to organize ourselves. The second thing that I think is really interesting is that nation states are becoming really not always the best vehicles to solve these problems. A lot of our problems are global in the scope, and impact is local. We have things like the Paris agreements, and we have the floodings that are happening in Florida right now, or the hurricanes and the massive disasters. It's all very, very connected. And I think that opens up for really, really impactful work on connecting the local with the global. I've seen, for example, cities take a much stronger role in issues like climate change. You have teaming up and working on implementing the Paris Agreement despite the nation states. It also gives us options to really rethink democracy in many ways. Yes, we have to go and vote, but since our country and the government that we have chosen isn't the only one who can solve our problems for us, we have to also figure out new ways of engaging in democratic processes on international level, on local level, and of course still on state level. And the third thing that I think is that it's really shifting the way we think, and I think it's incredibly important, especially sitting here in the United States, is that the world is changing. And the Western states will not dominate in the future in the way that we've done in the past 80 years. Africa is growing rapidly. It's the fastest growing region in the world, the youngest continent as well in the world. You have countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, United Arab Emirates, all creating new roles for themselves, new levels of influence in the world. And the old system that we've had has been very dominated by these these 5 countries that have been basically representing colonial empires in many ways. That time is coming to an end. And it can feel very scary, especially for those that are in those privileged countries. And this is a hierarchy that's shifting. And always when you lose privileges, you feel very vulnerable. But it is coming, and we need to have to figure out how to build genuine alliances across regions and shift and not bring in the remnants of colonialism into a new structure. And just to kind of close out, it's very easy for us to think that human nature is warfare. It's not true. I mean, conflict, yes, but warfare is not true. Human nature is actually cooperation. We're not the strongest species. We're not the fastest species. We are the ones that cooperate the most, and that's why we thrive as humanity. And as we enter a really unknown phase, we need to keep building and shifting sort of global rules and advance that for how we work together, for how we treat each other around the world, and how we navigate these main challenges that we're all in together. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much.